Let's look at Psalm 132. Psalm 132, verse 1 to verse 10. Let's read. Remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids, until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah, we found it in the fields of Jaar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the face of your anointed one.
모든 것에는 선발 기준이 있어서 사람들이 뽑아요.
Everything has or every selection has certain criteria.
국가대표 선수를 뽑는다. 그러면
So if you were to choose a national athlete, there is a standard.
하고 싶어서 뽑는 게 아니고
It's not because you want to do it.
야구 선수 뽑을 때도
When you pick a soccer player or a baseball player, there's a criteria.
하는 사람만 뽑아요.
And only those who are suitable and fit can be chosen.
학생을 뽑을 때
Even when we pick a player in college,
학교가 원하는 학생을 뽑아요.
you pick the athlete that your school wants.
대학에 들어가면 돈을 학교에서 주는 게 아니에요.
The money doesn't come.
돈을 내는데도 돈을 내겠다고 하는데도 선발 기준이 있어요.
The student has to pay for to go to the school, but even so, there's a certain selection, a criteria that must be met.
더군다나 회사는
It's the same thing with companies. You only get to choose what you want to.
자기 사람을 뽑으실 때도
Even when God picks the people he wants to pick, there is a certain criteria.
하나님 의뢰로 다 뽑는 거 아니에요?
Oh, but Pastor, isn't it all chosen by grace? Sure, that's what salvation is.
하나님이 은혜로 조건 없이 뽑으세요.
Salvation is given without a condition.
하나님이 일을 하실 때는
But when God works, it's different.
선택 기준이 있어요.
There's a different standard of being chosen.
하나님의 선발 기준.
And that's why the title of today's sermon is God's selection criteria. What is that criteria?
크라이테리아가 있어요.
When God picks someone, there's a certain standard.
기준을 맡기지 않으시고
He doesn't just have everyone do everything,
기준이 있어요.
but there's a standard that must be met.
근데 하나님이 사람을 쭉 보시면서
But when God sees all these people,
진짜 이 사람은 내 마음에 딱 맞다. 내 기준에 정확히
there's someone that's, oh, this person's really after my heart. This person really met my standard. There's one person in the Bible that exactly met that criteria.
하나님의 선발 기준은 그거거든요.
This is the standard of God's selection. He doesn't look at outward appearance.
그 마음의 중심.
He looks at the heart.
사무엘상 16장 7절에 사람은 외모를 보거니와 나 여호와는 중심을
So while people, they look at outward appearance, God looks at the heart.
보시는데
God looks at the heart. But if that heart matches with God, there is one that matched that center in that heart with God, and that was David. It was David, the son of Jesse. He was a man after God's heart.
그러면 다윗이 가지고 있던 외모는 아닌 거 아니에요?
And so it's not about David's outer appearance, it's about his heart. And so what kind of heart did David have that it matched perfectly with God's standard?
만약에 우리가 다윗이 가지고 있던 중심을 조금만 더 가질 수
If we were to have David's heart just a little bit, then God would be so pleased.
다윗의 중심에는
In David's heart,
하나님이 좋아하시는 가장 중요한 기준 기준이 하나 있었는데
there is an important standard,
겸손한
and it was that he was humble. He had humility.
우리 신앙생활에 굉장히 중요한 기회.
This is a very important key to our walk of faith.
다시 얘기하면 하나님은 겸손한 자에게 시대를 맡기시기도 하고
And so, for those who are humble, God entrusts a nation, God entrusts a people. But for those who are arrogant, God doesn't entrust anything. This is an important standard.
하나님이 교만한 자를 쓰신 적이 없으세요.
God doesn't use any arrogant person.
하나님이 하나님의 일을 심부름하시려고 만드셨던 피조 세계 중에
Out of all the creation that God made, there were also angels.
천사가 그 중에 장이
But then the leader of the angels,
그 안에 뭐가 들어요?
there was arrogance.
하나님 보이시죠.
And God cast him out.
그게 사람.
That's Satan.
교만은 굉장히
And
무서운
so arrogance is a very dangerous thing. And humility is the most blessed thing.
조금만 겸손함.
And so humility, if you were to restore that just a little bit, then God would be so pleased.
사람들은 어쩌든지 자기를 나타내고 싶어 하고
People always want to
인정받고 싶어 하고 알리고 싶어
stand out, be recognized.
못 견디죠.
They can't just keep to themselves.
그거 없앨 수는 없어요.
You can't get rid of that.
그걸 없애면 우리가 없어지니까
Because if you get rid of that, then we're all gone.
그걸 컨트롤할 수 있어야 돼요.
But we need to be able to have control over that. We need to be able to have self-control.
절제할 수 있어요.
We need to be able to have it
오늘 다윗
act in moderation.
여러분 고대 사회에서 절대 권력자는 다 수
In
있는
ancient society, the authorities always had absolute power.
얘기잖아요. 지난주에 봤을 때 130년
And we saw last week in Psalm
젖된 아이 같아요.
that David said he is like a weaned child when he stands before God.
됐어요.
He's just a weaned child.
힘이 없다는 얘기죠.
It means that he doesn't have any strength. A weaned child doesn't have any strength, doesn't have any power,
판단력이 없어요.
doesn't have any judgment. It's just a baby.
아무것도 없어요. 아무것도 아닌 게 없어요.
There's no maturity, there's nothing that the baby knows.
분별력도 없고
There's no discernment.
7% 부모에게 의존해요.
It's just 100% dependent on the parents.
자기가 혼자 스스로 할 수 있는 게 아무것도
There's nothing the baby can do on its own.
이치를 분별할 수도 없고 어떤
It's
게
not able to
아니면 어떤 게 안
discern reason, doesn't know what is dangerous or what is safe.
그러니까 사울이 자기를
And so Saul
괴롭히고 죽이려고
kept
쫓아가는데
hindering David, chasing after David.
이거는 누가 판단하는 거예요?
But who's the one that judges this?
좋은 사람인지 나쁜 사람인지 누가 판단해요?
Who's the one that knows if Saul's a good person or David's a good person or not? Saul's a good person or not? It's not David. He said he's like just a weaned baby. And that's where David excels.
두 번이나 다윗에게
There's
사울을 죽일 수 있는 기회가
Saul, David had two opportunities to kill Saul.
쫓아다니는데 하루는
But one day,
근데 어디까지 왔냐고요?
Saul's soldiers went to Saul went to where David was in the cave. And David thought, oh, now he's going to die because Saul's right in front of David. There is so much anxiety and nervousness that he has.
반대 상황. 갑자기
And suddenly,
발을 가리려고
Saul covers his feet.
자기가 숨어 있는 그 굴에 딱
And how is it that they're in the same exact cave?
가린다는 얘기를
What does it mean to cover his feet? It means that he's using the restroom.
화장실에 갔는데 군인들 다 데리고 있으면 없잖아요.
But he can't take in all the soldiers.
아무도 홀로 그 굴로 올라가요.
On his own, he has to go into the cave.
이건 완전 기회. 그냥
And so this is the opportunity.
다니고 틀에서 살고 했다.
And so trying to find a way.
그런데 나는 누구예요? 젖된 아이.
But then what does David say? He's just a weaned child.
하나님이 세우셨으니까
Because Saul is chosen by God, there's nothing he can do. There's no way he can choose what's right or wrong. He's just a weaned child. And so that's what happens.
그걸 하는 거죠.
So humility before God.
그럼 우리는
So for us, we like to judge and discern everything. We know what is right.
저 사람이 옳고 그리고 무박한다는 내가 다
Whether that person is right or wrong, I judge all the time.
그런 마음이 우리가 들어왔을 때 내가 판단하는 게 아니고
When those kind of thoughts come into my mind, we need to let go of those thoughts before Him and let God judge and discern.
그것뿐만 아니죠.
That's not the only thing.
하킬라 산에서
And when David was hiding in the Mount Hagilah, and Saul was encamping right before him, and then at night, all the Saul's him and his armies are sleeping, deeply sleeping. We saw it last week,
다윗에 함께하겠다는 얘기가
and those who are with David said, I can take him down with a single shot. Just let me do it.
다윗이 자기와 함께 있던
At that moment, this is what David said.
사무엘상 24장에 나오거든요.
This is 1 Samuel 24.
자기 사람들이 이렇게 얘기해요.
He said,
자기
He
사람들이
said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul.
얘기하는 거예요. 하나님을 경외한 법은 하나님을 경외한
So this is how David is teaching his men how to fear God, how to let God do His work. We are nothing but weaned children.
하나님 알아서 하시고
We should let God do His work.
그네가 창으로 사울을 죽이고
So
그걸 어떻게 이겨?
we cannot judge, we cannot kill God's anointed Saul according to our standard.
그 다윗 왕국 때
So
힘을 주셔서
during David's
싸워 나갈 수 있는 군인이
kingship,
30만 있었어요.
his army was counted up to 1.3 million.
모대사에서 엄청난
That's a large number according to ancient Near Eastern standard. If you think about Syria, they only had 185,000 soldiers. But with that number, Syria was able to, conquer the large Mesopotamian region. But now David has 1.3 million.
그 군대를 가지고 어느 나라도 돌리지 않았어요. 그 판단 누가 하는 거예요?
Yet David, with that kind of large army, he didn't conquer any nations.
어마어마한 파워를 가지고
With that
나라를 건드리지 않았어요.
tremendous power, they didn't conquer other nations.
왜요? 그 판단
Why? Because that kind of discernment is only up to God. I'm only a weaned child.
그럼 요즘 뭐 좋은 자동차들 많이 나오잖아요.
So, as we all know, there are many great cars that are
아침에
coming out.
트래픽이 막 걸리는 건 아니었는데 차가 굉장히 많았어요.
So, I was taking the highway and I saw many cars out there.
아마 다 라스베이스 갔을 때
I'm pretty sure after the July 4th, they went to Las Vegas and coming back to their home.
좋죠.
There are many great cars out there.
차가 우리에게 굉장히 이익이에요.
Having a car is a very profitable thing. It's a beneficial.
브레이크 고장나면
Yet, if the vehicle doesn't have a brake, it turns into a weapon. Something beneficial turns into a weapon.
브레이크 고장나면 순간 파괴야.
If there's no brake, it becomes a weapon.
우리 인생에 내 안에 올라오는 교만을 브레이크할 수 있는, 컨트롤할 수 있는 그 기능이 무너지잖아요.
If we don't have the ability to have brakes, then it becomes a weapon.
교회 온다.
If you come to church, you can become a weapon.
브레이크 시스템이
If you don't have the brake system,
중요한 중직자 될수 있어요.
if you have the brake system, then you become a very important church officer. But one second, there's a problem with your brakes. It's going to be a weapon. It's a very important key.
이익도 될 수 있고 흉기도 될 수 있어요. 뭐 하는 거
You can be a benefit or a danger.
컨트롤하는 기능 하나가 없어요.
That's what happens when you don't have the ability to control.
언제 그러면은 교만이 들어오죠?
And so when does arrogance happen?
예. 나를 보지 못할 때.
It happens when you're not able to see yourself. The thing that lets you see yourself is the word. The word is like your mirror. It is through the mirror you can see, oh, there's something wrong.
여자분은 마스카라가 다 문제인데, 그런 이제 화장이 다 떴네.
Or you might say, if you look in the mirror, you see something might be wrong with your makeup, or something's on your face. You need to look at the word in order to see yourself.
죄인이었는데
You can see, oh, I was a sinner. Oh, I was a mess. But I was living under God's grace. But why am I thinking that it was all me? We need to place the word in front of us in order to have meditation.
어느 순간 말씀이 들리지 않는다.
And so one moment you're not able to hear the word, then you need to know you're in a very critical, dangerous state.
하나님이 다윗을 보시면서
As God sees David,
성과를 주시고 하나님 앞에서 겸손함 그게 딱 맞았어요.
it's so important for David because he had humility, and that's what God saw. And secondly, we see in verse 2,
그가 여호와께
how he swore to the Lord and will vow to the mighty one of Jacob, I will not enter my house or get into my bed.
침상에 오르지 아니하고 내 눈을
I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids
졸게 하지 아니하기를 언제까지 이렇게 해요?
Until when? Until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob.
그게 아니라 언제까지요? 하나님의 성막을 찾기 전까지는
So until I find a place for the Lord, dwelling place, I'm not going back home.
그리고 내 침상에 올라가지 않게
And I'm not going to go to sleep.
내 눈으로 잠들게 하지 않고
I'll not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids.
언제까지요?
Until when?
하나님의 장막 찾기 전까지
Until I find a dwelling place for God. I'm not even going to sleep. That's what he said.
지금 다윗이 두 번째 하나님께로부터 인정받았던 중심이 성전을 생각합니다.
And so it is the longing for the temple that David had.
우리 1절에 본 것처럼
So firstly, it says, remember, O Lord, in David's favor all the hardships he endured.
겸손이 첫 번째 두 번째는
So there's humility and it's longing for the temple.
오늘 이 132편은
This Psalm 132, we don't know who the writer is.
그런데 주석가들이나
But when you look at commentators or scholars, they all say the same thing, that Solomon wrote this psalm.
왜냐하면 나중에 솔로몬이 성전을
The reason is because later on, when Solomon constructs the temple, there's a prayer that he prays, and the content is right here.
이제 저 뒤에 가시면 8절
You can see in verse 8 and verse 9. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy. And so this verse appears directly in Solomon's prayer. And so as Solomon remembers his dad, he's praying this. Yes, remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured. So Solomon's praying, remember my father David. How did David live? He lived just as we see in verse 2. He didn't even go home until when? He lived with that heart
언약궤를 찾기 전까지
until he found God's ark. He didn't go home. He didn't go to bed. He didn't sleep.
눈꺼풀이 감기게 하지
He didn't let his eyes shut.
않게 여호와의 언약궤를 찾기
That's how much he longed to find God's ark. And remember what my dad did. That's what Solomon's saying. And I saw this, I thought it was so impressive. If your own kids, later on when they remember you, they say, oh, this is what my dad did. He really longed for the temple.
우리 아버지는
Oh, my dad, They really worship God.
그렇게 기억된다면
If you remember for that, then that's the best life you could live.
지금 여러분의 자녀들이 여러분을
Right now, I don't know how your kids remember you. Don't really know how they would judge you.
우리 부모는
Oh, my dad or my parents, they were really humble. My parents, they really long for the temple.
그렇게 기억되면
If you remember for that,
하나님
then you're really someone who's after God's own heart.
다윗은 처음에는
In the beginning, David,
기름 부음을 받고 나서
after being anointed as king, he was running around in the desert for 10 years. And then later on, he becomes king.
12지파 중에
And now of the 12 tribes,
전체 왕이 됩니다.
it wasn't all of Israel that he was reigning over, it was just 2 tribes.
그러다가 시간이 또 많이
And then a lot of time passed,
아주 12지파의 왕이
and they became the king over all the tribes.
드디어 이제 나는
And now, he is king over all of Israel.
그럼 이제 뭐 해야 되겠죠?
And so what must he do now?
10년을 쫓겨나는
So being chased after for 10 years and only being recognized by 2 tribes,
견제하고 그가 겨우 왕이 됐어요.
and then he's finally king.
롱 베케이션이 있어야 된다.
He needs to have a long vacation. He needs to rest now.
내 인생 왜 이렇게 힘들었냐?
He needs to say, look back and think to himself what a hard process it was. But that's not what he did.
그렇게 왕이 되자마자
As soon as he became king,
지금 이 중심 가지고
you see, with his heart, he didn't even go home. What did he find?
하나님이 뭐냐?
He was trying to find God's ark.
빨리 성막 안에
He went to place that in the tabernacle. It's just a tent.
그냥 가장 중심에 들어와야 되는
But then the most important piece is not there, the ark, and no one knows where it is. He wants to find that.
그게 그 다음 절 나오죠.
That's what it says in the next verse.
5절에 여호와의
In verse 5,
전문대의 성막을
it says, Until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob.
그것이
Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah.
우리가 아마 솔로몬이
He's saying, Behold, we heard of it. So Solomon wrote it. Him, his father, those around them. Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. Oh, it's in Ephrathah, the ark. We found it in the fields of Jaar. Where's the ark? It's in the fields.
그동안 사울이 왕으로 있을 때 뭐 했어요?
When Saul was king,
혼자 찾아냈어요.
no one was finding the ark.
언약궤가 어디 나무밭에 있었는데
The ark was somewhere in the fields, but no one had interest. There was no worship happening.
언약궤를 어떻게 오해했어요? 이상한 두 아들 있잖아요.
It's just the 2 sons of Eli.
베세라고 전쟁하는데 이걸 가져가면
They thought, oh, if we fight against the Philistines, if we just take the ark with us, then maybe we'll win.
베세라가 전쟁하고 뺏겼잖아요.
But then they got the ark stolen.
블레셋이 언약궤 가져갔어요.
The Philistines took the ark.
신전 다원 신전에 세워놓죠.
They placed it in front of their god Dagon.
이상한 일이 생겼어요.
And then strange things happened where the Dagon statue, the pieces of it would be broken, and then the statue even fell over.
다른 데로 옮겼는데
So they moved the ark somewhere else, and then people would die. And so they realized, we can't keep this ark, so they send it back to Israel.
언약궤가 돌아왔는데
And the ark comes back, but no one has interest.
어디 있었대요?
Where was the ark?
브라다에 있는 나무밭에서 세웠어요.
It's in the fields in Ephrathah.
그게 다윗과 사울의 차이.
That's the difference between David and Saul.
언약궤를 찾으려고
David was trying to find the ark,
잠도 자지 않았고
and he couldn't even sleep. But Saul doesn't even know where the ark is. That's the difference.
하나님의 선택 기준 있잖아요.
There's a certain criteria for God's selection.
사울도 구원하셨고 다윗도 구원하셨고
Saul was given salvation, David was given salvation, but being used by God, there's a certain criteria.
여러분의 배경도 묻지 않으시고
He doesn't ask your background or your appearance.
능력도 묻지 않으시고
He doesn't ask your ability. He just asks your heart.
그래서 하나님의 언약궤를 찾아서
That's why he finds the ark
이제 성막 텐트가 있는 곳으로 가져오잖아요.
and takes it to the place of the tent, the
다윗의
tabernacle.
인생 전체
We look
하이라이트.
at David's life, the highlight, the peak of his life. People might think first the scene of David and Goliath.
골리앗과 싸웠던 장면은 교회 다니지 않아도 알아요.
But even if you don't attend church, people know about David and Goliath.
저는 이 구절이라고
But I think it's this verse.
7절이죠.
It says in verse 7,
우리가
"Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool."
드디어 성막 언약궤 얻는 걸 찾아서
Finally, they found where the ark is,
이제 모시고 가요.
and now they're taking
이게
it.
어떻게 되냐면 이렇게 가요.
And how did they go?
한번 읽어드릴게요. 사무엘하 6장인데요.
It says in 2 Samuel 6.
띄워드릴게요. 다윗이 이스라엘
David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000.
지금 언약궤가 있다는 걸 알게 됐어요.
So they know that the Ark of the Covenant is here.
12지파에서
Out of the 12 tribes, these people are chosen.
가장 뛰어난 사람, 가장
The most excellent, the most spiritual. They take these men and they gather 30,000. And then they go find the Ark of the Covenant. It says David arose and with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. Then we look at the Septuagint. It says that there's 70,000. So it's not really sure if it's 30,000 or 70,000. But 300 years before Jesus came, there were the diaspora. They don't really know Hebrew anymore. They use Greek. So they translate the Old Testament into Greek, and that's the Septuagint. And so people look at the Greek, and even Jesus looked at the Greek. So whether it's 30,000 or 70,000, still all these people, they came to worship before the ark. It says in verse 7, "Let us go to his dwelling place, let us worship at his footstool." This is David. And then they load the Ark of the Covenant. And it's not a simple thing. When the Ark of the Covenant is about to fall, there was someone who tried to catch it, Uzzah, and then he dies. So it's not a simple thing. People see how serious it is. And they leave the ark in that place for a few months. For us, we might think, oh, we should never touch it. But that's not how David's heart is. He wants to do his best to take it back to the tabernacle. And so he has the priests give it another shot. And they do it in fear and trembling. And then finally, the ark enters into where the tabernacle is. And David is so happy. He's dancing around. He's so happy. He's so overjoyed. His clothes are falling off. But David's life, there's so much sorrow and sadness, but there was never a time where he was so happy like this. When he killed Goliath, the Bible doesn't explain his emotions. It wasn't that he was so happy and jumping around. There's no scene of that. But when the Ark of the Covenant entered, he was so happy. That's the person David was. Someone who really longed for God's temple.
법궤를
But
성막에
David,
가져오고
when he brought in the Ark of the Covenant,
그리고 하고 싶었던 일이 있었어요.
and there's something that he wanted to do.
이게 만족스럽지 않은 거예요.
Right now, it's not
첫 번째
satisfactory where he's at.
생각하고 또 생각했던 일이
Because there's something he's thinking about, something he's planning.
하나님의
He realizes
임재에 걸맞는
there needs to be a temple that is worthy of God's presence. He shouldn't just dwell in a tent.
하나님의 위엄에 맞는
That's why he says that he wants to build a temple that is worthy of God's majesty.
기뻐하실 거라 생각했는데 하나님 뭐라고 얘기하시죠?
And he thought God would be so pleased, but God said no.
그럼 스탑해야 되는데
And so he needs to stop
그렇게 하는 게 아니에요.
and realize that this isn't the way to go. But David doesn't just let that stop. He has such a passion.
레바논에 배를 보내가지고
He sends the boats to Lebanon to bring all the cedar wood.
은과 금
He gathers all the gold and the silver. He gathers it all in one place.
그게 이제 짓기를
And then
자기가 지을 수 없는
he's planning to build it. He can't build it himself because God said no.
자재를
And so he prepares all the materials.
그냥 있지 않아요.
And he doesn't just sit by. He makes the blueprints. He says this many cubits, this height. He makes all the blueprints, and he doesn't just end there.
이렇게 만들어졌을 때
He says when things are finished building, then the east gate needs to be with this tribe,
너무 간절한
or there needs to be a certain shift.
성격을 지켜. 늘 그 사람 머릿속에는 잠을 자나 일어나서
And so whether he's sleeping or awake, there's constantly happening. He's saying, oh, when it's finished built, someone's gonna protect this gate, someone's gonna protect that gate,
이 소년들을 봉사를 할 거예요.
someone's going to devote for this purpose.
그래서 설계도도 짓고
So he makes the blueprints, all the materials.
혹시 여러분 그런 거 경험 해보신 적 있어요?
So I don't know if you've experienced that before.
집을 짓거나
When you build a house or your business, you need to build something,
시리에서 컴퓨터
but the city doesn't give you a permit.
자재 다 갖다 놨어요.
Even though you have all the materials,
쌓아놨어요.
you have all the best materials ready.
시리에서 1년이 넘는
But after a whole year, the city still doesn't give a permit. I've heard of those stories before, and it makes you go crazy because there's no permit.
자재 다 준비해.
You prepared all the materials. Right now, if you just build it, then you have the picture. You have the door, you have the decorations, and you have the interior, you have everything ready. But then the permit is not ready,
날마다 자재 막 만들고
and you touch all the materials, and you check. You think, oh, I need to build it.
그런 경험 있으신 분이 있지요.
There's people who experience that.
다윗의 심정이에요.
That's what David's heart is like.
다 준비했는데
He prepared everything,
자기는
but then he himself can't build it. Who has to do it? His own son.
하나님 그 중심을 보셨어요.
God saw that heart, a heart that wants to really long for worship. It's not that David wanted to build a building, he wanted to worship.
그러니까 건물을 짓지 못할 때
And that's why when he couldn't build the building, he was in front of the tent. He called all the worshipers, the choir, and thousands would just keep praising.
나중에 아모스서가
And then later on, Amos records
다윗의 그 장막을 추억하시고
that God misses and he reminisces on that booth of David.
예배당 펄밋도 안 났는데 했다 그랬어. 장막
Even though he doesn't have the permit to build the temple, every day he's gathering thousands to praise and worship, and God misses that. God wants to see that again. God remembers that. That's David's tent.
우리 교회 기도 제목에 다 있어.
It's even in our church prayer topics
그런 예배.
to restore that kind of worship.
그 중심만 회복되어
If we just restore that, then your life is set.
하나님 앞에서의 겸손함과
Humility before God, longing for worship.
하나님 지금 겸손함과
Even now, God is looking for that person. Let us pray.